Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on Russia and the Middle East. I want to start, as we probably all should during these sessions, thanking Mehrdad and Artie Kia, who've been putting on this conference at an astonishingly high level for 17 years. And this panel gives us a chance to talk about Russia. And there are, as you undoubtedly know, serious questions about U.S.-Russia relations. One of the main issues that seems to come up periodically in the talking heads or shouting heads on television is whether Trump is indeed harder on Russia than his predecessors. I think it raises not just a question of policy, but it raises another question, which is how to sort out rhetoric from policy. Is the rhetoric of an administration, whether this one, the last one, or any other administration, worth paying attention to, or should you watch what they actually do? And to begin to sort all this out, we have a very good panel to help us through some of these issues. My advice generally is, when you're dealing with complex questions like this, talk to people who actually know something about the topic. It's always a good idea rather than shouting heads on television. I realize it's an unusual, somewhat radical approach, but not a bad idea. Our panelists today include Bob Seiden-Schwartz, who, I didn't know this until I saw this biographical note, was born in Bayshore, New York in 1955, the same year as my kid's sister. He moved to Missoula in 1972 to attend the University of Montana, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. He has spent basically much of his adult life as a financial advisor. He's a founding partner of S.G. Long Investment Advisors. But he is also, and I think this may be somewhat more relevant to us here, has been president for a decade between 2006 and 2016 of the Montana World Affairs Council, and is now President Emeritus. And maybe even more relevant for the moment, he is a visiting scholar at the Center for Central, Southwest, and Asia here at the University of Montana. And he's going to be a big help, I think, in steering us through some of the economic and related issues. Our other panelist, Rob Green, is a professor of history at the University of Montana. He's also the chair of the history department. He did his BA at the University of Rochester, his PhD at the University of Michigan. His primary area of specialization is Russian and social and cultural history. In particular, the history of Orthodox religion in Russia and the Soviet Union. If you haven't read some of his work, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is insightful, creative. It is really a model of historical scholarship. For those who didn't hear the comment, it's available on Amazon. Many of you undoubtedly know him from his Mali classes, which draw cult-like followings. If any of you are ever invited to attend a session on Russia in Central America, maybe take Nancy Reagan's advice and just say no. You never know. But in any case, he's going to be particularly helpful, I think, about issues of foreign policy relations with Eastern Europe and so on. The way we're going to approach this is I have a long list of topics that I'm going to throw out. I don't expect to get through all of them, but I'm going to ask for comments from the panelists. It's going to be very informal who will discuss this. And after about an hour or so, maybe a little bit less, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, and I hope one or more of us will be able to do some answering. So let me move over to my spot in the middle there. I can't tell whether it's just to sort of moderate the thing or to keep them apart, but let me move over there. Okay, the first thing that I thought we could talk about was what weight should we accord the bromance between Trump and Putin. Trump says that Putin is bright and tough. May be right. But how important is that relationship as opposed to the structural relationship between the two countries? And I think I'll start by tossing this to Rob first.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. the bromance between Putin and Trump. I think this quotation from maybe 2 winters ago, where Putin described Trump as a bright and tough individual, the adjective yarki, which he used to describe Trump, means bright. It can mean bright, but it can also mean rather sort of rather an extraordinary character, as you might speak of your cousin who you keep in the basement or something. So bright in the sense of, you know, rather a special president. I think it's always hard to talk about this. I mean, as Mike said, my specialization is in 19th and 20th century Russian cultural and social history. So talking about the present and making predictions is fun, but every prediction I've ever made in this or any other sort of forum is always wrong. So this is all purely speculative, but hopefully informed by some sense of historical perspective. I think if you look back, the many presidents of the United States who have met with and interacted with Putin since 2000, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Trump, these relationships start in a very similar way. They seem to get along well at first. Bush was captivated by Putin's persona, his charisma, his bright, shining blue eyes. Obama had a decent relationship with Putin early on. Trump may still be in the honeymoon phase if his comments at Helsinki last year are any indication, but I think if the Trump presidency follows the model of the past 2, I think there'll be rather a cooling down period. And there's certainly a lot to cool down about. The questions of NATO, questions of involvement in Ukraine, which we can touch on. But I wouldn't expect this romance to last too much longer.
Bob?
First, I want to welcome everybody here, and I just have to mention this. One of the absolute thrills about coming here is that a very old and dear friend came up to me. I hadn't seen her in decades, and it absolutely made my day, week, and year. So for purposes of privacy, I won't mention the name, but just say thank you so very much. It was an absolute pleasure. So welcome, everybody. I have learned over the years, both from an historical perspective as well as just common sense, judge by what people do, not what they say. While I had a lot of hopes initially during the early days of the administration, it became very clear to me that growing up in New York, right outside of New York City, I had enough experience with Donald Trump, the non-president, to realize that pay attention to what is done and not said. And that has been pretty evident. So while this is good to talk about, it's interesting, it's intriguing, it's a great news story, it's meaningless to me. What I look at is what's happening between the different entities that have to deal with each other on an ongoing daily basis, and more importantly, the actions and reactions on a much larger and longer scale. So very simply, judge by the actions, not the words.
Thanks. I think a related topic, one of the things that has impeded this bromance has been, and certainly that turned the relationship with the Obama administration sour, was the invasion of the Crimea and the Ukraine. And this is an interesting point. People have raised issues about whether this administration has in fact responded more aggressively than the last. Certainly, this administration sold lethal armaments to the Ukraine, which is a step. They've continued and expanded sanctions, but which goes to Bob's point about pay attention to what they do rather than what they say. But on this one, I think maybe Bob, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
And we had gotten together a couple of days ago, and I wanted to ask both of you this, and then I'll answer the question. When he goes into Crimea and then eastern Ukraine, is it not factual that we have an agreement with the Ukraine in terms of a military agreement that if invaded, we come to their assistance and aid? That was one of the reasons the Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in the first place, was the assurance of U.S. protection or NATO protection in the case of an invasion. So I'd like to just get clarification on that, and then in terms of what you were just asking, kind of continue from there. So
I think that's right, but from the perspective of the Russian government, the position of the Russian government is that this was not an invasion at all.
Okay.
Crimea was transferred to Russia by the will of the Crimean people. An impossibly high percentage of voters voted yes in that referendum, 90+%. And although it's obvious that the Russian military has played a role in the military actions in the eastern oblasts, the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russian government's position was that this is a sort of popular manifestation of the desire of the people in this region to break free from Ukraine and determine their own political future. So they're sort of using this kind of veneer of a Wilsonian language of national self-determination, and of course will help our friends in the eastern oblasts. But this is not an invasion. At least this is the sort of legal fiction that the Kremlin puts out there. But it's the number one enduring issue in Ukraine today since 2014, 2015, and is certainly the sort of issue around which the current presidential elections in Ukraine are revolving. But I think you're right. But as Putin says, this is not an invasion.
So did that then, in effect, Robert and Michael, signal to the Kremlin, while not technically being an invasion, it's a chance to push the envelope. It's a chance to show what type of response or lack of response we get back from the administration. So if you take it from that perspective, I'd be interested in your insights as to how that may have been perceived action-wise by the Kremlin.
I think with the exception of a few of the most saber-rattling warmongers in the West, few voices were willing to risk a war with Russia over Crimea or over the eastern provinces of Ukraine. So probably on the one hand, I think this shows Putin that there's a certain amount of territorial give here, that he can push his territorial ambitions, such as they are, without a full-blown Western response. I just saw a study the other day from the Levada Institute, which is one of the few independent public opinion research organizations working on the Russian Federation today. 80% of Russians believe that Crimea is and ought to remain a part of Russia. That's down from 90% a few 2 or 3 years ago, but 80% of Russians today believe that Crimea is and ought to remain part of Russia, and 54% of Russians polled say that they hope the whole thing just sort of fades away and that people just stop talking about this so we can get back to normalizing relations and patterns of everyday life and economic activity and travel and cultural exchange with the Western powers, and not have this sort of Crimean issue hanging over us. It can be interpreted in one of two ways. You've taken this, so now leave us alone. Or, on the other hand, let's try to normalize to some degree get back to business. Right, exactly.
The decision to get back to business, though, leaves particularly the Baltic states more than a little bit nervous. And Rob, what do you think about that?
Well, I think since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have enjoyed perhaps the most successful economic growth, the most successfully sort of vibrant civil society and political stability of all the post-Soviet republics, I think. That's fair to say. And the last thing that the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian people want is to go back under this kind of Soviet aegis. And so there's a great deal of anti-Russian sentiment in those regions, which kind of translates into an affinity for closer ties with the EU and the NATO West. And I think that is all well and good, but from the perspective of Moscow, you're talking about territories that had been part of the Russian Empire since the turn of the 19th century, that had broken away after the revolution of 1917, had been forcibly reintegrated during the Second World War, then forcibly reintegrated at war's end, and these are territories that belong in the Russian orbit, according to the most strident of Russian nationalists. So this is a potential place to watch, I think, where there could be some hot spots on the Baltic and further tensions there between NATO and Russia.
I learned some time ago from two very erudite individuals, these guys, in talking about Russia and why they do. I mean, that's one of the fundamental questions for me is, excuse me, always trying to assess why do countries act in certain ways? What's their motivations? What's their history or economic or political interest? And we had a discussion quite some time ago about that if you look at it through the Russians' eyes, the expansion of NATO was an agreement that I believe was broken.
Absolutely.
So if I'm Russia, and I'm going to ask these two gentlemen to explain the historic geographic boundaries that are so important to the protection of the motherland, since you have to understand geography to know what and why certain things happen. Excuse me, guys, I'm getting over a bad cold here. If you're Poland, you existed between what two countries? Russia and Germany. Not exactly the neighbors you want. So geography plays an incredibly important role, and I'm going to ask you from the standpoint of that historic land barrier, how do the Russians see this when they see a promise being broken?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, Bob, and I'd be curious to hear, Mike, what you think about this from a U.S. foreign policy standpoint as well, because my understanding is that as a condition for Gorbachev to permit German reunification in 1990, George H.W. Bush's administration, James Baker, then Secretary of State, assured Gorbachev that NATO would not expand further to the east. I'm not sure to what degree that's an anecdotal story or that's a gentleman's arrangement. If it was a gentleman's arrangement, it certainly hasn't been observed since the early 1990s. But I think there's not necessarily a sort of Russian equivalent to the Monroe Doctrine, but Americans bristle at the sight of Russian advisors in Venezuela, or certainly missiles in Cuba not too long ago. Well, it was a long time ago, but historically not that long ago. Areas that, part of our hemisphere that we regard as part of our natural sphere of influence, zone of control. And these are areas that, last time I checked, are separated by vast expanses of water. And with regard to Poland, as Bob points out, with regard to the Baltic states, Ukraine certainly, these are areas that have not just geographical contiguity with the Russian motherland, but are regarded as historically part of the greater Russian Empire, for right or wrong, and certainly the consternation of some who are supportive of independence and autonomy for those peoples.
I think it's also that traditional Russian concern with security, especially on their Western Front, was obviously exacerbated enormously by World War II, when the Russians lost somewhere maybe 25 million people. The figures are all over the place. But they lost 7 million soldiers, more than everybody else combined on both sides. And at the end of the war, one of the few things I think that historians can say with certainty about Soviet foreign policy was that they wanted a secure Western border. And that meant, in spite of all of the sort of countervailing forces that Rob's mentioned, it meant domination of Eastern Europe. And I think, setting aside concerns about the post-war world in which America clearly had a dominant economic position, which meant if there was open trade and free exchange between the West and these countries, the United States would have a disproportionate role. There was also concern that many of these countries, for nationalistic reasons, for historical reasons, for religious reasons, were anti-Bolshevik, but even more than that, anti-Russian. And the Russians, the Soviets in those days, couldn't abide having hostile countries or countries that were not very friendly on their western border, because they'd suffered through 2 invasions in a generation and lost untold numbers of people. I mean, Russians of my generation and even of younger generations, there's not one who doesn't know somebody who, or have a family member who was lost in the Second World War, an uncle, a great uncle, a cousin, something. I mean, the toll was astonishing, and I think in part accounts for it. And it may not be justified in geopolitical objective sense, but there's a reason for it nonetheless, I think.
Yeah, I think the degree to which the Second World War persists in Russian society and Russian culture, the Russian cultural imagination, historical memory, to this day is tremendous, and to a degree that I think is difficult for Americans to fully appreciate just how pervasive the cult of World War II, the respect with which the defenders of the motherland are still held and observed to this day. I mean, one of the few public, vestiges of old Soviet political theater is still the performance of the victory parade and the sort of commemorative anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. And in fact, this is, I don't know if you want to talk about Ukraine right now, but I was thinking, I just read something interesting the other day about probably the only thing that the Ukrainians and the Russians can agree on is the importance of World War II in their nation's historical memory. They remember it in very different ways. And the Ukrainians are remembering it in some ways that are rather problematic right now, actually. But when the Ukrainian parliament recently passed its decommunization law, which was an attempt to rid public space in Ukraine of all symbols and vestiges of the old Soviet order, and this involved changing street names, changing the names of towns and villages and factories, taking off all the old hammers and sickles that were still on the facades of public buildings. They took down 1,000 Lenin statues. They had to rename somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 towns and villages. 30,000 streets had to be renamed. It cost $1.5 billion just to tear down the old signs, put up new signs. All statues of Lenin had to be taken. The one thing that was exempted were World War II military graves, and soldiers buried in military graves on Ukrainian soil. If they had a military red star on their tombstone or on their gravesite, that was permitted to remain, which I think is some testament to just how enduring the memory and the memory of loss of the Second World War still is in that part of the world. And that memory of loss, as Mike and Bob allude to, is an important part of Soviet foreign policy after the war and the origins of the Cold War, and I think plays some role in foreign policy today.
I think another important area that's worth talking about would be economics, which is one that is full of problems. Energy, I think in particular, is a relevant issue, and the Nord Stream pipeline is one thing. And I thought I'd start by turning this one over to Bob to talk about.
This is an area that I've spent a great deal of time not just looking at Russia, but really the entirety of the geopolitical complex of energy and where dynamic changes are taking place, because Russia receives the majority of its hard currency from oil exports. The U.S., the Saudis, and Russia are the largest oil producers. And in fact, the U.S. has now surpassed, I believe, even the Russians and the Saudis in oil production, which is important to understand the distinction. It's not necessarily barrels of oil, it's the entirety of the byproducts that also come from oil as well. So when you add up natural gas exports, the fact that we took some of the legislation away to allow for U.S. oil exports, and the byproducts that come from this, the U.S. has now become an energy powerhouse that used to reside in the hands of OPEC. used to reside in the hands of a country that at one time, it still does, I should say, have more oil in terms of in the ground than anybody else. And that's, interestingly, any guesses? Sorry? No, it's in our hemisphere. It's a country that's in complete disarray right now, Venezuela. Venezuela, you may not know, was one of the original members and founding members of OPEC. So if you want to understand the kind of dynamics of what takes place from a geopolitical standpoint, you have to look at where countries generate their revenue. And historically, countries that are singularly dependent upon a particular resource tend to be the most corrupt, authoritarian, and the most at risk to what happens when commodity prices and supply-demand situations change. So I urge all of you that want to have a little bit more insight into this to also look at what economics are in terms of what they drive and the implications of this. Russia has an aging infrastructure when it comes to their oil and their gas. A lot of it is located in parts of the country which are extremely far away from some of the centers and infrastructure. They're in very harsh conditions, and the technology that is needed has been principally imported from the West. The Russians do some really good things in terms of what they're capable of with technology, engineering, the arts, but when was the last time somebody demanded a car built in Russia? You know, think about what Russia exports to the world, and I have a hard time coming up other than they exchange meats and they exchange produce and goods and services with Poland, with Germany, and other countries, but they are very vulnerable if oil prices were to drop precipitously, which they did several years ago. When I've looked at the economies of oil-producing countries, and you need $70 or 80 or 90 or 120 bucks to run your economy, and oil was at 20, 30, 40 bucks not that many years ago, you are in dire straits and you're very vulnerable. So a great deal of what drives Russian interest and need is securing the pipelines, the contracts, access to the technology, the equipment, the infrastructure, the workers, to make sure at the current time this very important resource, which is a direct protector of its economy, is going to be staying in place. We mentioned Crimea earlier. Guess what's off the coast of that area, or peninsula, I should say? A lot of oil and gas potential. And the Russians, seeking to have something that close to them, naturally would look at this as an area that is in their backyard, is in their vital interest, and it made perfect sense because there's a lot of area to be explored off that area, off that peninsula, which could have huge quantities of oil and gas. So I'll stop right here, but I just want to kind of plant the seed that this is going to be a constant theme throughout this discussion, and it is with almost every country that is not multifaceted in its economic vitality.
I think just in support of what Bob was saying, something like 60 or 65%, I forget exactly what, of total Russian exports to the West is oil, or oil and gas. It accounts for an enormous percentage of what they are able to sell to support their economy. And the converse of that is that a number of European countries are heavily dependent on Russian energy to keep them warm in cold European winters. And that's a security concern for the United States as well. And again, there are controversies. Finland's involved in this with the Nord Stream, the pipelines that go to the north, and whether or not the United States can offer an alternative to Russian energy that's a little bit closer. Rob, did you have anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bob's points about Russian, the sort of all eggs in the Russian economic basket are in natural resources right now, to be sure. And the aging infrastructure is not the most seductive, sexy topic, but it's a very real problem in Russia. And I think in large part, the enormous cost of maintaining, overhauling, and expanding Russian infrastructure to get where the oil is, get where the gas is, bring it back in the most cost-effective manner, and export it, as Mike says, largely to European markets, is tremendous. And I think in part the tremendous cost of overhauling and modernizing Russian infrastructure is one of the reasons that Russia is now looking to expand into the Arctic, which, for reasons whether you believe them to be man-made or not, is certainly getting a lot easier to drill for oil in the Arctic and to extract gas. And so Gazprom Neft and other big Russian gas companies are moving into the Arctic, and Russia absolutely has a big jump over other sort of northern hemisphere powers when it comes to sort of staking claim to an economic presence in the Arctic, and that's a big issue. The gross domestic product of Russia has declined since 2011, and that's a consequence of being hitched to one single commodity on the world market, and Russia will live or die as the Soviet Union lived or died based on global oil prices.
I'd like to add something to that, as Mike alluded to. What else may exist out there that could be problematic for Russia, and where does the U.S. possibly come into a role from a strategic standpoint or from an economic standpoint? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that we've had a revolution as a result of fracking in terms of natural gas production, oil. Now, we can discuss or we can look at the pros and cons of more fossil fuel development, but just stay with me for a moment. This has led the U.S. to become one of the lowest natural gas producers in the entire world. And if you remember Fukushima, when they had to shut down their nuclear facilities for a period of time, the Japanese are dependent on imports. They get about 20% of their electric generation from nuclear power. Well, you take one of their primary plants offline, where are they going to get the resources from? Well, more coal production, but LNG, liquid natural gas, which there is a rush to develop the facilities in the United States as well as in Australia, another very large producer, and they're going to be exporting this LNG. It's got to be liquefied, put on a ship, transported, de-liquefied, and then used as natural gas. They're paying $12, $13 MCF, which is just a representation of what you're getting per cubic foot. We produce natural gas here at about, in some cases, under $2 MCF, which means we've got an abundance of natural gas. That's why these facilities are being built, because we see an opportunity to become the supplier. And this is one of the things that I know Trump mentioned very early on in his administration, which is, why are you doing business with Russia? You know, you've hitched yourself to that wagon and all that comes with it. We can be producing the LNG, shipping it to you, and doing it where the security issues, and I'll ask my two colleagues to comment on that, because that's another part of the component that we don't often think about, which is from our interest and a national security perspective, how that helps us as well as providing jobs and being able to have a good trading partner. So, Mike, Robert?
Yeah, after you.
I think one of the things, just to pick up on what Bob was saying, that's one of the things that the Trump administration has consistently urged is closer energy relations, especially with Northern Europe. And one of the main security interests in doing that is to limit the influence of Russia in that regard. Because right now, Russia has a hand on the switch to Europe.
What did they do to the Ukraine not too long ago?
Right, exactly. If they turn the spigot and the natural gas and the oil cuts off, Europeans are buying a lot of sweaters in the winter. Mm-hmm. And I think that is it's an interesting security issue. I was reading something last week, I think it was, one of the places where it's playing out most dramatically is Finland. And I guess that's not really surprising when you consider the history of Finland. But Sweden's also concerned not only about that, but about accompanying Russian military demonstrations of strength in their waters or near their waters and their airspace and so on. All these things are the security and energy are very closely interrelated.
Yeah, I think Europe gets something in the neighborhood of 35% or so of its natural gas from Russia, and this has been one of the factors, I think, behind the reconsideration of, for instance, the German government on the question of sanctions, whether it's time now to lift or reduce Western sanctions on Russia. Which I guess, maybe I'm curious to hear what others think about this, but do you think the sanctions are working? Is it time to lift them? Ought they to be reconsidered, or what do you think?
Well, and that's one of the really interesting questions, because the sanctions were put on primarily the invasion of the Crimea and the invasion of the eastern provinces of Ukraine, and then again as a penalty after the election for the Russian interference in the American elections. Right now, I think it's 7 of Russia's wealthiest individuals and 17 officials in government positions are sanctioned. In addition to which, in this current administration, you've seen the closing of Russian diplomatic installations in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York, and the closing of the consulate in Seattle. So there are economic sanctions, there are political sanctions. The economic sanctions, I think, are the ones, as Rob said, that really worry the Europeans the most, because trade looks pretty good to them, especially in terms of energy.
I'll try to be very brief here, because this is a really big question. Historically, sanctions do not work very well, because as long as you have outlets to be able to purchase what you need, and you don't have cooperation of your supposed allies, it's very difficult to make those sanctions work. We do see an effect on those sanctions. I would like to think that as the U.S. has developed this economic ability to export oil or gas, what we maybe don't want to say is, you shouldn't buy your natural gas from Russia. It's right there in your backyard. But if there's behavior that has an effect and an implication from a security standpoint, from an economic standpoint, that is bad behavior, can we use the potential that we can come in as a alternative supplier to possibly get Russian behavior to change? And that's one of the things that I look at. I don't know that I have an answer, but I want to have in my back pocket the option of being able to use that if necessary, versus not having that option and leaving Russia in a stronger place. So I would rather use a carrot and a stick. I don't want to beat them over the head. The Russians have proven by beating them over the head, they only retreat further into the country and they get meaner. So,
well, I think the unintended consequence of sanctions, I mean, we think about what sanctions are intended to produce and what economic and political and cultural effect sanctions actually do, in fact, generate. And I think one of the unintended consequences of U.S. and Western European sanctions on Russia, for the reasons that Mike laid out, one of the unintended consequences of that is that it plays into the Kremlin's argument that we are encircled by enemies on our borders, and fine, we'll just work all the harder. I mean, just this past week, Medvedev, the Prime Minister, made a statement in which he said that actually food production is up. The Russian economy has become more self-reliant. We don't need to import our food from Europe any longer. We'll make our own cheese and ham and everything else. We don't need this. So, and then, of course, this plays into a kind of patriotic, even jingoistic sentiment on the part of some who in Russia who would prefer to see greater economic self-reliance and less reliance on the import of foreign goods. So I think when we think about the effect of sanctions, there's this sort of economic effect, there's the sort of political goals with which those sanctions are imposed, but then there's also this whole terrain of unanticipated consequences that can have sort of rhetorical, that can take on a rhetorical form of their own.
Yeah, I wanted to move from economics to the Middle East, which economics are always part of that too. But obviously the United States and Russia have disagreements over Syria, over Turkey, over Iran, over Hezbollah and Hamas. And I think maybe Rob, I think I'll maybe start with you with Syria and consider some of the competing interests that the United States and the Russians have in the ongoing civil war or whatever it is in Syria.
Yeah. Well, I think the Russians have regarded Syria as on the extreme borders of a sphere of influence going back to the 19th century. Tsar Nicholas I, in the first half of the 19th century, declared that Russia was the protector of Orthodox Christians, Eastern Christians living under Ottoman rule. This led directly into the Crimean War, the first Crimean War of the 1850s, and certainly during the Soviet period too, especially after World War II, the Khrushchev regime drew much closer to Syria, in part as a means of trying to put a check on the possibility of Israeli expansion and closer ties between the U.S. and Israel, and a fear that Israel would project power in the region. So Putin has long supported the Assad regime before the Civil War, certainly during the Civil War, which has stretched out now for, 5 years or so, with an enormous human and economic cost. One of the things to think about, I think, with regard to the Syrian conflict is the announcement from the Trump administration in recent weeks that the U.S. would recognize Israel's control over the Golan Heights, which of course Syria sees as part of Syria. And I just read recently a statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry declaring that any change in the official status of the Golan Heights would be a direct violation of UN resolutions. So you have this sort of curious scenario where the Russians are very eager to uphold UN resolutions, at least on this particular question. The Russian government has not, and probably will not, disclose the number of troops that it has in Syria. It seems probable that they're rotating troops out. I read something recently that 50, 60, you'll find all sorts of numbers online, but maybe as many as 75,000 Russian troops have been sort of cycling in and out of Turkey. By some estimates, close to 100,000 Russian airstrikes have been made against anti-Assad rebel strongholds, and all of this is increasing the immiseration of the Syrian people. But I think, and I don't want to go on too long, but the point I want to make here is that beyond the historical reasons for Russia's close ties to Syria, beyond the fact that Syria is Russia's only naval partner in the Mediterranean, Syria also becomes an arena in which Russia can demonstrate to the world that the Russian government upholds and defends the legitimacy and sovereignty of developing nations against a Western strategy that has shown itself for some time now to be not at all shy about engaging in regime change when it does not like a regime in power. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, maybe Venezuela next with all its oil. So discursively, rhetorically, Russia can position itself as the defender of stability and legitimacy against Western efforts to undermine existing regimes. And that's a message that may not play well here, but it plays very well in what we used to call the Third World and among non-aligned nations. So I think that's part of the Syrian question that needs to be considered.
I think also, Rob's point is very well taken, especially since if you look at what some would regard as a kind of feckless American policy at times, Mubarak, the protests, withdrew support from Mubarak. Mubarak ends up in a cage. And Libya, granted, Gaddafi was a tyrant, a thug, a murderer, terrorist. But by the time that the intervention in Libya, he was in a box. I mean, he was a threat to nobody except his own people. And he was even helping with the war on terror. And those two guys ended very badly. I mean, Gaddafi's people literally tore him apart. And if you're a third world despot, Look at the other hand. Assad, who looked like he was in real trouble, the Russians stuck by their guy, and he's still there and shows no signs of going away. And there's a very clear lesson out there to some people. And I think also the Russians gained what they really needed out of Syria. What they've always wanted out of Syria is the naval base, and also air bases now. And they've got that in northwestern Syria, and that's stabilized. And that's Assad's not probably going to be able to hold on to Syria as it existed, but he's able to hold on to that northwestern piece, and that's where the Russians have their military installations. And so in that sense, they've achieved strategically what they set about doing there as well. Bob, did you have...
I just am always fascinated by the collective amnesia that we have as superpowers, be they Russians or French or Germans or the U.S. We go into these areas, and do we really think through the process of how long we're prepared to stay, how much national treasure in human capital as well as in dollars we're prepared to bleed? And I wonder a little bit, so it's a rhetorical question I'll put back to you two, have the Russians gained a victory at the moment, or as it appears, but if we see a further downturn, just hypothetically, oil prices, alternative energy gets more of a foothold, where does the capital and the benefit analysis still favor Russia? Is it the prestige? Is it the real strategic area that they need to be in? Many of you probably don't know, but Israel has had a number of military forays into Syria using their jet fighters. And the Russians know this, and the Syrians know this, and the U.S. knows this. So, sometimes I look at this and I go, collectively, it's kind of a shugana. So I ask you to, is this a Afghanistan, not maybe in the same way it was for Russia, but are they really thinking through the long-term process in terms of what they perceive to be their benefits?
Well, probably not. I mean, I think Bob's point is a good one. A lot of, I mean, we could go down the list of decades-long military entanglements into which great powers have entered with little to no regard for the long-term costs and consequences. And certainly Afghanistan is a case in point. I mean, pick your great power that's been involved there. I don't know, other than keeping the Assad regime in power and claiming victory against ISIS, which I think is sort of a related point here for the Russians, how much there is to gain, what treasure there is to be had in Syria beyond the base, beyond loyalty to the ally, beyond claiming some credit for the subjugation of ISIS. I don't know what the long-term goal there is. And maybe there's people in this room who know more about Syria than I certainly, so maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A too.
Yeah. One more thing about the Middle East before I wanted to move on to one last topic before we open it up, and that is Turkey, which is becoming an increasingly complex and difficult area, a country for the United States. It's a NATO ally. It's moving closer both toward Islamist influence, and it's also moving closer to the Russians. And one of the things I just toss out there as a topic is the friction that's come up as the Turks have purchased that Russian S-400 system, anti-aircraft system. And it's called into question whether the F-35, which is the new U.S. fighter that's supposed to be the standard for NATO, should be delivered to Turkey, which has this aircraft system, or the Russians, designed to shoot down the future of American airstrike power in the region. So these sorts of issues. I mean, Russian influence in Turkey has grown considerably. Turkey's moved away from the U.S. and NATO in some respects. It's created a problem for what used to be called NATO's eastern flank. Bob, I think I'll start with you on this one.
If you follow defense stocks over the last couple of years, they've done extremely well. And even though it's my business, there's a part of me that just goes, oy, what we're seeing is a global escalation. When you think about China, the U.S., Russia, and Middle East, that is escalating this system that Mike just points out. You've got a missile defense system. I have to find a way to counter that missile defense system. There's tremendous amounts of capital and research taking place right now for that next generation of military hardware and equipment, which is meant to maintain your leadership, which I'm not sure where it takes you sometimes, but I will tell you it is a growing and continuing escalating, especially when you start to look at China, concern for the United States, and it is leading to a lot of investment in these defense companies. So it's, at the moment, it is what it is. I am also fascinated by that when I look at Turkey, you have to really separate the urban from the rural. So while you have Islamism that may be growing, you have to look at, is it happening in the cities, the more urban areas, versus the more traditional, possibly less educated, economically stressed areas of Turkey. And I think there was a recent election here that puts Erdogan a little bit on notice, and I would ask you to maybe elaborate that on a bit, because while something may be happening and shifting in one direction at the moment, sometimes the very underpinnings to that change are also taking place too, and it may take several years to fully reveal itself. But that's the real key for people in our situation, is not to look necessarily at what's happening at this moment, but to see the shifts and changes that may be taking place as we speak.
Yeah, well, for those who didn't pick up the reference, what Bob was referring to is there in local elections, Erdogan's party lost local elections, and primarily in urban areas, which may be bad news for him, or it may not in national elections. It remains to be seen. Rob, did you have anything?
Well, I would say to Bob's point about global arms sales and aid packages, and I mean this connects, I think, with Mike's points about Turkey purchasing the defense hardware from Russia. Are we still going to sell them jets as a result that could be shot down with the material they've already purchased from Russia? I mean, the amount of money that is involved here, I think, will find a way, regardless of politics. I read the other day that since 2014, the U.S. has spent $1.5 billion in Ukraine on defense hardware, on military training, on equipment, surplus materials, all this sort of thing. $1.5 billion. The Kremlin is very fond of saying that, you know, our deals to Turkey notwithstanding, our global military sales notwithstanding, our own defense spending notwithstanding, the West outspends Russia on defense by a factor of 22 to 1. Now, that 22 to 1 factor is not accurate because it's based on the ruble, which doesn't buy very much. So it's really 3 to 1, probably. But even 3 to 1 is crazy to think about. So, you know, I think these individual deals that call into question, you know, Turkey's loyalty to the NATO alliance, or how is this going to affect our dealings with Turkey, whether Erdogan remains in power or not. I think, you know, these are difficult to say. But if you look at the big picture, as Bob suggests, there's no indication that arms sales are going to be going down anytime. Yeah, I mean, if you have any money, you put it in weaponry. You'll do pretty well.
Yeah, which is another point that I had thought about, but we're not going to have time to get to. But that is the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which looks like it's going out the window. And you know, again, there are arguments on both sides. At the time it was signed, it cut off some development of the arms race back in the 1980s. Whether it's relevant now, the technologies have changed. It doesn't include China because they weren't a party to that and they weren't a player in that regard. Now they're a major concern. So that's related. I want to, just before we open it up, to raise two related points. One is the question of whether we are entering a new Cold War with the Russians, and the extent to which statements from former intelligence officials have contributed to this. And since Rob particularly raised the latter issue when we were talking about it, I think I'll start with Rob on this one.
Well, about these Cold War and immediate post-Cold War treaties, the INF Treaty, START II is up for renegotiation in a year or two. There's been no activity on that, so far as I can tell. If those treaties lapse, it's further evidence, I think, to Bob's point. Someone's going to make a lot of money when those treaties lapse, and so, and maybe that is an indication that there's a new sort of Cold War. I think that we, at the risk of getting too kind of philosophical or metaphysical, I think that we understand geopolitics and foreign relations in terms of models and paradigms that are familiar to us. And I think if you did a Google search for new Cold War in quotes, I imagine you'd get a ton of hits. I should have done this before so I could tell you exactly how many, but you'll get a lot. And I think that's a testament to the fact that we think about U.S.-Russian relations through the prism or through the lens of that paradigmatic Cold War model that defined U.S.-Russian, U.S.-Soviet relations for more than half a century, or nearly half a century. So if it feels like a new Cold War, if we're talking about it like a new Cold War, it will become then a new Cold War. If you allow it to become a new Cold War, it certainly will. And Mike's point about intelligence officials, I read something the other day, and I printed it out because it was so astonishing. There was a piece in the New York Times by an author, Alexei Kovalyov, who is an investigations editor at Meduza, which is one of the few independent Russian media outlets. This was in the New York Times, March 29th, 2019, and he talks about the effect of Russophobia, the effect of Russiagate, the effect of talk about Russian meddling, all this sort of cable news fascination and fear-mongering about Russia. And the point that Kovalyov makes in this piece is that this kind of discourse affects not only great power relations at the diplomatic level and at the negotiations table and in terms of the decision to renew or not these global arms treaties, it also affects at the human level how populations view other populations. It affects cultural exchanges, it affects economic activity, and Kovalyov points out that for liberal democratic-minded Russians like himself, who are politically, culturally, socially predisposed to be friendly to the United States, to look warmly to the United States, all of this kind of Russophobia and anti-Russian xenophobia, as he describes it, that is voiced in the American media, isn't doing anything to help his cause and the cause of people like him. And he gave in this piece a nod to a recent interview by James Clapper, former director of national intelligence. Clapper recently said, Russians are almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever. He just sort of runs out of steam and can't think of a fourth verb. So, I mean, these are the worst and stupidest of, the worst and stupid kind of Cold War analysis, right? The famous argument in the 1950s by one cloistered think tanker who said that the Russians were so cold and distant in their negotiations with the West because they'd all been swaddled too tightly as infants. But for someone like Clapper to come out and say that Russians are almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever, these kinds of stupid statements not to put too fine a point on it, stupid statements, aren't doing anything to help repair now or in the long run U.S.-Russian relations, which needs some help.
Rob, Bob, do you have anything quick to add to that before we open up?
No, because it's not going to be quick. I mean, we just, I hope you have a sense and taste of how vast and complicated this is, and asking yourself the question, why do you come here? Why is it not in the Montanans? To have this kind of presentation, discussion, I hope you take away from this when we get into our questions why this is important to us, because I tend to be kind of the bigger picture, results-oriented, and I look down the road and I go, yeah, you add another 2 billion people to the planet in the next 20, 30 years. You got to feed them, you got to provide jobs, you got to provide security, add all the issues of potential implications of global warming, making sure we have enough energy coming from what type of resources to be able to meet those basic needs. And there's a much greater reason to be optimistic and to cooperate than there is, to Robert's point, to maintain this type of, demagoguing that we seem to be very good at as opposed to the problem solving. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that we're going to find a lot of ways, because when you can make money and solve problems, people get excited.
On that note, it clicked off. Are there any questions? And if you have questions, please go to the mic. There's a mic right over there, and we'll be glad at least to try to answer them. I'm not making any promises about effectiveness.
I had one question about...
Please identify yourself.
My name is Steve Wing. About Central Asia, since you didn't talk much about it, what's happening in the 5 stands that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and also in Georgia where they've screwed around a little? How much are Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan worried, and also Iran?
That's a very good question. I'm going to let Rob take a shot at that.
Thanks. Well, I think with regard to Georgia, here again you have a country that has a very close, intimate, often painfully so, history with Russia. A country that Russia regards as part of its natural historic sphere of influence. And I think that was one of the precipitating factors in the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, namely the fact that Georgia, from the Russian perspective, Russian government's perspective, was getting a little too close to the West, and close to NATO in particular. And the idea of Georgia becoming a full-fledged NATO member was a prospect that elicited great panic in Russia. I think the chances of NATO membership, even the most geographically fanciful expansion of NATO, would probably not extend to the stands of Central Asia. But there I think the big news is what's going to happen in Kazakhstan now that the president has finally, after how many years, all of them, decided to sort of step down, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens there. But I'm happy to turn it over to Bob for further thoughts.
That's beyond my pay grade. As far as the stands go, I know enough to be dangerous, but won't comment for fear of embarrassing myself.
Isn't there a session with Meredith that will, and Meredith knows a lot more about this than any of us up here,
and Artie is talking about this, Professor Artie Key is going to be talking about this tomorrow, so maybe we'll refer to someone who actually knows a lot more about Central Asia than I do.
It's a good idea, plus it's a plug for that session. So, anybody else have a question?
Hi. I had a couple questions. There's a lot of talk in the news about the complex negotiations between the U.S. and Trump and China and getting trade going there. And any comments regarding that? There was a huge piece in the Wall Street Journal about China's relationships and with Europe, and also their involvement in South America and essentially all over the globe. Sort of the take being that, where is the U.S. if China has got its fingers all over these places in the globe? And also, what are your thoughts about improving, all these scare pieces, about the U.S. versus Russia? This has been going on for so long. How do we undo this stuff so that we can have a better relations with this country? I took a Russian history course a long time ago, and I remember some of the points you were making about the suffering that these people have gone through in their history. So, thank you.
Before I turn over the answer to what do we do, but turn off your television and read something. That would be a good start. In terms of trade, I think I'll start this one with Bob.
Tomorrow at 10:30, Tiff Roberts, his father was Dexter Roberts, a beloved professor here at the university. He spent 20 years as a bureau chief for Bloomberg and Business Week. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him twice on the radio, and I've learned a great deal, spent a great deal of time with him on exactly your question. So to get a really insider's look at this issue, if you have time, tomorrow would be a great opportunity at that session. I want to give a little bit of a pre-warning here. China, of course, is very aggressively expanding. And you always have to ask the question, for what reason? It goes back to economic and energy and resource security. Now, while they may be expanding very rapidly, we've not had a recession here in the U.S. for quite a few years. I'm not going to say it's next year or the year after, but I see growth already starting to slow in Europe. We're starting to see signs of that in China, which, by the way, Dexter will make the point tomorrow that it's very difficult to trust the numbers actually coming out of China. So they have put an awful lot of their resources, meaning capital, and prestige on the line to fulfill what they call Belt and Road, which is a very aggressive expansion to secure trade and relations and influence, which is what, quite to the point, the United States has been doing for decades. Nobody is better at expanding their interest on a global basis than the U.S., so why should we be surprised when somebody else attempts to do it? But if we go into a global slowdown, many of these plans and much of the leverage that has been involved in terms of the capital, as we saw in 2008, could go to the wayside very quickly too. So while it has implications that can be very positive, you really always have to look at what if scenarios come to pass. And are you prepared to weather those storms? Because inevitably they always do and will happen.
Rob, do you have anything to add, especially with respect to scare tactics?
Yeah, I think to the second point of the question, sort of how do we kind of combat this frantic, hysteric discourse about Russia and all the misunderstanding and misinterpretation we see. There's a lot of talk about information literacy on this campus, on campuses all across the country, as one of the sort of skills that one is supposed to cultivate in preparation for citizenship in the 21st century. I think this is a good point as to where this might be brought to bear. I mean, listening and reading uncritically is how we got into this mess. So all this talk about Russian intellectual meddling, if you can't distinguish between a real story that you see in the news, in the press, versus obviously a piece of constructed nonsense that appears on your social media feed, there's a real problem here. And reading Dostoevsky is not necessarily going to show you any insight into the Russian soul. It's going to, but just being able to think critically, examine your sources, the kinds of skills that we teach in the humanities and the liberal arts, they have a relevance in terms of this sort of national conversation. Being able to tell and distinguish the difference between truth that is evidence-based and falsehood and manipulation that's based on nothing. This is an important skill, and it's a skill that you hone and develop through reading and analysis and critical thought and writing. And I think that Mike's point about turning off the TV and reading is sage advice. I think that's, hopefully we can think and educate ourselves out of this mess, but we're not going to rely on the great social media giants to solve this problem of Russian bots on our own. There's no way you can. There's always going to be some 14-year-old kid in Macedonia who's going to find a way around this. And the bigger and scarier problem is, if thinking about the implications of Russian infiltration, is that so many people were dumb enough to believe that nonsense. Not to put too fine a point on it, but how you fix that is a really big question and a really big problem. But there is a way, but it takes time.
Any other questions? We've got somebody heading down. Oh, good.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Kelsey Murphy, and I'm a student here, and I just presented before you guys on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And part of what I discussed was that Israel's main concern right now is on the northern borders with Hezbollah and the Syrian army. And I was wondering if Professor Green could speak to the evolution of Israeli-Russian relationships, and maybe Bob to what Russian involvement in Syria right now means for those relationships in Israeli policy.
Thank you, Rob.
That's an excellent question, Kelsey. I think, and a very difficult one to answer. Based on what I know about first Soviet and then later Russian relations with Israel, stormy, I think, is an adjective that we might use to describe those. The Soviet government during the Stalin period was very concerned about the decision to create an independent state of Israel. And I think over the decades, as the relationship between the United States and Israel grew closer diplomatically, and understanding developed between the United States and Israel, this is part of what, again, in that kind of bipolar, Manichaean Cold War mindset, is what pushed the Soviets to draw all the closer to hostile powers on Israel's borders, Syria included. So, and that seems to be a sort of a tendency that I think the Russian government has inherited from its Soviet predecessor. But as far as maybe the economics of it, I could
before we move to the economics, I think Rob's point is worth emphasizing. And again, as Rob said, it's very complicated. The Soviet Union was very concerned about the creation of the State of Israel, and yet it wasn't necessarily really overtly hostile for the first better part of a decade. In the 1956 war, the Soviet Union obviously threatened to intercede on the side of Israel and France and Britain's opponents, but the United States was cooperated with the Soviets in halting the military action. I think the real turn came in the mid-60s when the Soviet Union defined Israel as an imperialist state, as an anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and the left in obviously Eastern Europe, which didn't have that much choice, but around the world sort of followed that, and as Rob said, increasingly, and especially up to and after the '73 war in the Middle East, the Soviets moved closer and closer, not only to arming but supporting diplomatically in almost every way Israel's opponents, and so that has a lot to do with that. And I think the bipolar world of the Cold War determined a lot of that.
I have to really watch myself because I can usually find some kind of saucy way of expressing things, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that. But Russia and Israel have had a relationship that has expanded and contracted, depending on the circumstances of the region, who are competing interests. As of recently, Israel and Russia have had pretty good relations. And in fact, Netanyahu has been there, there's been trade delegations, there's been exchanges. So Syria comes into play, and the importance of maintaining those relationships are that Israeli military and Russian military people can work and cooperate. I'm not so sure what the end game may be, but keeping those lines of communication is very important and necessary. The other component of this, and I've had this discussion very often through the years, Israel, for all that it does wrong, also offers economic opportunities like no other nation in the Middle East. Their leadership in technology, whether it's software, cybersecurity, water. You may not know that the Israelis are probably the preeminent water experts on a global basis, and have worked and cooperated with countries even though they did not have friendly relations, but it was always very quietly. And if there's one issue in the Middle East that will have to be solved if there's going to be prosperity, it's water and its allocation. And the economic opportunities that Israel can bring to that region, should there ever be some degree of stability and cooperation with some of the great powers that can influence some of their relationships, the potential for what the young populations need in these countries is jobs and opportunities. And it's not going to be provided by a country like Jordan, who is overwhelmed with refugees, whether it could be Palestinians, whether it may be people coming out of Syria. So there's a lot of opportunity that exists if the circumstances will allow for the development and nurturing of what they do offer and what is needed.
We've got time for about one more question, if there is one.
My name is Levi Goddard. Have a question for y'all regarding Russia-U.S. relationships, possibly stemming from World War I during the Russian Civil War, and seeing the U.S. as kind of a backstabbing power to the Russian fight, especially since the U.S. kind of half-heartedly got involved. And if it's at all possible that a lot of the wounds you see today are just scars from the First World War and a lot of betrayal that happened in that war.
Before I turn it over to Rob, I think I'd watch some of the charged language of betrayal and backstab. For one thing, I think if the United States did do anything to the Russians, they front-stabbed them during World War I rather than backstab them. But it is true that the United States sent 2 expeditions during the Russian Revolution onto Russian soil with various pretexts. One was to protect armaments at Murmansk and Archangel, and the other involved a Czech unit that was fighting. And the United States specifically military was ordered not to get involved in the Russian Civil War. Inevitably, of course, they did, and they fought to roll back Red or Bolshevik influence. And that certainly didn't do anything to enhance warm relationships between the Bolshevik government and the United States government. Not that and also the United States didn't extend formal recognition to the Bolshevik government. And that certainly didn't do anything to enhance relationships between the 2 states. Neither, for that matter, did the expropriation of American property by the Russian revolutionaries do anything to enhance. This is not exclusively a one-way street. It's not a secret. Both sides knew that. And I think, again, you see a very long and rocky relationship throughout the 1920s. The Soviets were perfectly glad to buy tractors from Henry Ford. Relations warmed a bit with recognition in 1933. The United States extended formal recognition. Things got worse after the Nazi-Soviet pact, and then things got better after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. So it's a long and complicated pattern that can't be chalked up to one simple thing. And I think I'll leave it to Rob, who knows a lot more about the Russian side than I do.
Well, it's something that certainly played a role in the formation of a foreign policy by the new Bolshevik government after 1917. Not only the United States and the Czechoslovakian Legion, as Mike pointed out, but also the British, the French, the Japanese, all had foreign troops on Russian soil, defending strategic interests, defending economic interests, during the Russian Civil War. And you had somewhere in the neighborhood of, numbers vary between 25 and 50,000 so-called foreign interventionists. One of the many fronts on which the Russian Civil War was waged from 1918 to 1920, 21 or so. And the memory of not only U.S., but French, British, Japanese, Czechoslovakian soldiers on Russian territory helped to create, in the 1920s, this enduring notion of the Soviet Union as the sort of citadel of world revolution, beleaguered and besieged on all sides by foreign enemies who desired nothing more than the destruction of the Soviet experiment and the dismantling of the Bolshevik project to build socialism and move on from there to the communist utopia. So I think that certainly is a powerful factor in the formulation of an early Soviet foreign policy. I don't know to what degree Western intervention during the Russian Civil War is part of the Russian school curriculum today. I don't know to what degree or what percentage of Russians are very familiar with that chapter of their nation's past, to what degree that informs attitudes toward the West. But I think, looking at the big picture, I do think it's part of, or it can be seen as part of, this long narrative of enemy encirclement on our very borders, and the fear of encroachment. So I think the symbolic significance of the foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War is perhaps more important even than the actual sort of material presence and military maneuverings of those soldiers.
Well, with that, we're just about out of time. I want to thank everybody for coming and for paying attention, for good questions, and leave you with just one thought that Rob actually raised at the beginning, which is that historians can provide a lot of answers in the sense of the past, although we have a hard enough time predicting the past. I know some questions asking about the future. Historians really can't predict the future. And as Rob said, all his predictions are wrong because all of us are always wrong about the future. Thanks very much for coming.
Always.
Oh.